Most drift mods in Assetto Corsa feel great for a few corners, but once you start pushing them, you realize the car is actually helping you the whole time. The rear catches too easily, transitions feel light, and mistakes disappear before they really have consequences. These N-style cars use Tsujigiri physics, which are supposed to behave much closer to a real drift chassis. So what I want to see is whether the car still behaves the same way once you really start to push it. In the first few corners, something about the balance stands out. The car actually pushes the front more than I expected. If I come a little too fast and try to rotate the car with only throttle, the front tires start sliding and the whole car wants to run wide instead of snapping cleanly into angle. And that's interesting because a lot of drift mods do the opposite. They make the rear very easy to rotate while the front almost always grips enough to point the car where you want. Here, it feels like the front axle actually has limits, and if you overload it, the car simply refuses to turn the way you imagine. So this first run is mostly about figuring out what the chassis wants. I'm not trying to drive perfectly yet, I'm just feeling out how much rotation the car naturally gives you and how early the front tires start complaining if you try to force the drift too aggressively. And the biggest thing I'm noticing is that exaggerated inputs don't really work here. If I flick the wheel too quickly or jump on the throttle too early, the rear rotates, but the front doesn't follow the way you expect. So the car drifts wider than the line I was aiming for. After a few corners, the balance starts making more sense. The car doesn't really want the steering to create rotation. It wants the weight transfer to start the drift first, and then the throttle carries the slide once the rear is already moving. If I rush the entry, the front washes wide, and suddenly I'm using more steering than I should just to hold the line. But if I slow the entry slightly and let the chassis rotate before committing to throttle, the whole drift settles and the corrections get smaller. And that's usually when physics start to feel believable, because the car isn't reacting instantly to every steering movement. The rear rotates progressively and the corrections feel more like guiding the momentum of the car instead of just commanding it to slide. Earlier, I drove the same car on the toge run, and the balance felt almost identical there. If you rush the entry, the front pushes and the car drifts wider than expected. But if you slow the entry slightly and let the rear rotate first, the drift settles in a much more natural way. The only difference is that it's descending on a steep toge, so gravity plays a huge role. Back at Gunsai, even though it isn't as steep, the behavior feels exactly the same. So on the second run, I'm trying to drive the same sections a little cleaner. Not chasing a perfect line, but smoothing the inputs to see if the car actually rewards that approach. So instead of forcing the car into angle, I'm letting the chassis rotate first and feeding throttle once the rear is already moving. And almost right away, the whole car feels a lot calmer. The steering corrections get smaller and the front tires hold grip longer. And the drift angle becomes easier to manage because the car isn't constantly fighting itself. The more believable the physics become, the less dramatic the driving usually looks from the inside cockpit. It's less about throwing big steering inputs around and more about managing how the car rotates and letting the weight transfer do most of the work. At this point, the front push that felt strange earlier actually starts making sense. It forces you to slow the entry slightly and be chill with the throttle before asking the car to rotate. When you do that, the drift settles into a really predictable balance where the rear rotates progressively and the steering corrections stay pretty small. But if you get impatient and try to rush the entry, the front tires slide and the car stretches wider than the line that you wanted. And that balance is what makes the physics feel convincing. It's asking you to manage the weight transfer properly before committing to throttle. Coming into this last hairpin, I carry a little bit more speed than I should. And right there, the front tires start sliding and the car runs wider than I expected. The rear is still drifting, but the front doesn't bite the way I hoped. So the correction ends up being bigger than it needed to be. And honestly, that's probably the most convincing moment of the run, because if you overload the front tires mid-drift, the physics don't rescue you. The car just keeps doing exactly what the chassis and tires allow, and that consistency is what makes this mod feel believable. I'll catch you on the next run. Peace.